Tonight, the recipe box is placed back onto the kitchen table. The small dark brown wooden box rests quietly beneath the weak yellow light, its lid slightly warped after many years of being opened and closed during difficult evenings. One corner of the box is chipped. Inside, the old recipe cards lie stacked together, their paper edges curled from kitchen grease and time. Some cards carry grease stains that have darkened with age. Some are marked with faded coffee rings. Some hold only a few faint pencil lines so pale they must be tilted directly beneath the light to be read. And the strangest thing is that many of them hardly look like recipes at all. Sugar sandwich, ketchup, lard on bread, potato, wish, just a few short words, as if during those years people had simply become too tired to write anything longer. Tonight, the recipe box is opened. This box was never kept because of its beauty. It remains here because inside it still holds the things a working family never wanted to lose. A grease stain in the corner of a card, a hurried line written before bed, a meal so poor that the person writing it may have struggled even to call it a recipe. Yet those cards are still read again, because if nobody remembers them anymore, then those kitchens disappear one more time. Outside were the early years of the Great Depression. Inside the small kitchen, weak light fell across 2 slices of white bread, a jar of lard nearly scraped to the bottom, a bottle of ketchup almost empty, and the final soft potato left in the basket. The mother stood before a kitchen cabinet that was nearly bare and wondered what could still be placed between 2 slices of bread today. Inside those kitchens, sandwiches were made from the leftovers of life itself, from a little gravy, a thin slice of onion, and the hands of women who knew how to keep their families alive for one more day. And near the bottom of the box tonight, there is still one card, almost empty. On it are only 2 words: wish, sandwich, 2 slices of bread, and the wish that there might be something in between them. The cards that almost had no filling. The first cards inside the box make people understand very quickly that there were years when America went hungry in a far quieter way than many people today imagine. They rest crowded together among yellowed sheets of paper, their edges curled upward from kitchen steam and time. Some were written on the back of store receipts. Some were nothing more than small scraps torn quickly from flour sacks. The pencil marks have faded through the years, yet a few words remain clear enough to read beneath the old yellow light. Sugar sandwich, ketchup, mustard, just a few short words like that, and yet behind them stood an entire kitchen trying to make sure children went to bed believing they had eaten supper. During the early years of the Great Depression, many working families had to stretch a single loaf of bread through nearly an entire week. When cold cuts disappeared from the table, when cheese became too expensive, when eggs had to be saved for the days a father needed strength to search for work, condiments began taking the place of food itself. And that is the barest level of poverty hidden inside this recipe box. The first card reads, sugar sandwich. The mother places 2 slices of white bread on the table, then spreads the thinnest layer of leftover fat across the bread. After that, she sprinkles sugar slowly and evenly, carefully saving even the last few grains. The soft rattling sound of sugar falling is very quiet, yet inside the silent kitchen, it is enough to make a child lift their head. To adults, it is the sign of a kitchen cabinet running nearly empty. To children, it is still sweet. And sometimes a difficult day could be held together by something exactly that simple. The next card carries a faded red stain in the corner of the paper. Ketchup sandwich. Some ketchup bottles had to be turned upside down for a very long time before the last bit of sauce finally slid out. The mother taps gently on the bottom of the bottle, then uses the back of a knife to pull the thin red layer from the center of the bread all the way to the edges. She still cuts the sandwich diagonally before wrapping it in brown paper, as if that shape could somehow make the lunch appear a little fuller. That sandwich did not keep a stomach full for long, but it still had color, flavor, and the feeling of someone trying to care for a family with the very last thing remaining in the kitchen. Then came the mustard sandwich. The sharp smell of yellow mustard was strong enough that the moment the jar was opened, the kitchen itself seemed to grow tougher somehow. The mother spread the mustard in a very thin layer, smoothing it carefully all the way to the edges before folding the bread together. The mild sting of mustard made white bread feel less plain for a few brief minutes. And those poorest recipe cards of all are still telling an old truth, that when there was almost nothing left in the house, 2 slices of bread still had to become a meal for someone before nightfall. Making bread feel heavier than it was, the cards buried deeper inside the box begin to feel heavier in the hand. The paper is darker. The edges have stiffened from grease and kitchen steam. Old fingerprints remain faintly pressed into the lower corners, as if those cards had been touched over and over again during cold mornings before work. And the more a person reads them, the more they understand that those poor kitchens never survived through luck alone. Everything was calculated. Which meal costs the least? Which meal kept a stomach full the longest? Which meal could carry a man down into the coal mines before sunrise and keep him standing until late evening? A mother during those years did not look at a sandwich as a snack. She looked at it as fuel. She needed something that could stretch a few more hours of labor, a few more lessons at school, a few more miles of walking through the cold. And because of that, white bread began to be made heavier than itself. The first card carries the smell of old fat, lard sandwich. The mother opens the small jar beside the stove and uses a knife to spread a very thin layer of lard across the bread. If there is salt left, she sprinkles a few grains on top. Some days she presses the bread quickly against a hot skillet so the fat melts slightly into the center of the bread, making the surface glisten beneath the weak firelight. Today, people often think of fat as something to avoid, but during those years of hard labor, fat meant energy. A thin layer of grease was sometimes the only thing helping a body survive long hours of work out in the cold. Then came the potato sandwich. Mashed potatoes between 2 slices of white bread may sound heavy to modern ears, but to many families during the Great Depression, it felt like fullness. The mother boiled the potatoes until soft, then mashed them with a little salt and the last spoonful of gravy left from the night before. The potatoes, still slightly warm, were spread thick across the bread, softening the inside and holding warmth a little longer. That sandwich was honest. It never tried to become something beautiful. It was made to keep the stomach quiet for a few more hours. And then there was the bean sandwich, a meal that carried within it the entire survival logic of a poor kitchen. A pot of beans always began the night before, sitting on the stove for hours until it softened and thickened. The next day the leftovers were lightly mashed and spread onto bread with a little of the thick bean broth. Perhaps the old recipe card carried only a few short words. Beans from supper. But the woman standing in that kitchen understood the rest through memory and through her hands. She knew that one pot of beans had to survive through many meals, many days, many different sandwiches before it was truly gone. These sandwiches tell the story of an old rule that once lived inside almost every working American kitchen, that anything still usable still had value. And the deeper one flips into the box, the more grease stains appear on the cards, as if her hands were still there, continuing to hold on to every small leftover piece and turn it into one more meal. Nothing was allowed to go to waste. After supper, when the plates were nearly clean and the last piece of meat had disappeared from the table, the kitchen was not truly finished yet. Beneath the weak yellow light of working-class homes during the Great Depression, one woman remained standing beside the hot cast-iron skillet. At the bottom of the pan was a thin brown layer clinging tightly after the meat had already been removed. To many people, it was something to wash away. But to her, that brown layer still carried the flavor of supper. And if flavor remained, then value remained too. The cards in this section are darker from grease and touched more often than the others. They tell the story of an old kind of wisdom, where one small egg, one cheap can of salmon, or a little leftover gravy could all become another meal if used the right way. The first card reads, Gravy Sandwich. The mother places the skillet back onto the stove and adds a little water or milk to the bottom of the pan where the thin brown layer still clings. A wooden spoon slowly scrapes away the dark streaks as they melt into a light gravy, carrying the smell of meat already eaten the night before. She pours that gravy over bread and lets the soft center soak up the warmth and flavor. In many kitchens during those years, the meat itself disappeared quickly, but the flavor of the meat remained behind. And as long as the flavor remained, people could still stretch it into one more meal. Then came the fried egg sandwich. The sound of an egg cracking into the skillet was very small, yet during those years it was enough to make a lunch feel far more respectable. The mother warmed the last bit of grease remaining in the pan and fried the egg until the white had barely set. If the egg was too small, she broke the yolk so the golden center could run out and soak into both slices of bread. One egg placed between two slices of bread did not make the meal rich, but it created the feeling that someone had spent time standing beside the stove to prepare something hot and truly worth eating. The final card carries the smell of fish and old canned oil. Salmon patty sandwich. A small can of salmon is emptied into a bowl, then mixed with cracker crumbs and egg to create more patties than the fish alone could make. The mother shapes each small, flat patty with her hands before placing them into the hot skillet until the outside turns lightly golden. A single can of fish that was never enough for an entire family suddenly stretched farther because of a few old cracker crumbs and the careful skill of hands already used to measuring every portion of food. These sandwiches tell the story of something the recipe box has always tried to preserve through every old card. That inside those kitchens, leftovers were never seen as worthless. They were the next meal waiting to be rescued through memory, patience, and the hands of a woman who understood that sometimes an entire family could survive one more day because of the very things other people had thrown away. The meals that sound strange now but made perfect sense back then. Some of the cards inside the box make modern people pause for a few extra seconds. One pencil line reads, "Peanut butter and pickle." Another card says only banana. Along the edge of one old piece of paper remains the stain of vinegar that dried long ago. If these meals are read with a stomach used to overflowing supermarkets and refrigerators always stocked with cold cuts, they sound strange. But inside poor kitchens during the Great Depression, people never had the luxury of asking whether a meal made sense for the times. The real questions were much simpler. Did it have flavor? Did it make lunch easier to swallow? And did it make use of what was still sitting on the kitchen shelf? The pantry historian lingers longer over this group of cards because they are easy to misunderstand. These were not meals created to seem unusual. They were born from the honest observations of poor kitchens, where taste itself had to learn how to work with whatever remained. The first card reads peanut butter and pickle sandwich. The mother opens the jar of peanut butter and uses a knife to spread the thick layer all the way to the edges of the bread. Then she places several pickle slices on top, the sharp crunch resting between the heavy richness of the peanuts. It sounds strange to many people today, but inside that kitchen, everything had a reason. Peanut butter gave energy and the feeling of fullness. Pickles brought salt, sharpness, and crunch that made the sandwich feel more layered. Poverty often creates combinations that abundance never has to imagine. Then came the banana sandwich. One ripe banana was sliced into very thin pieces and arranged carefully across white bread. Some days, she added a little mayonnaise or sprinkled the last bit of sugar remaining at the bottom of the jar. For children, this may have been the gentlest sandwich of the week, soft, sweet, and easier to eat than many other meals. But behind that gentleness still lived the old mathematics of a working kitchen, how to stretch one banana as far as possible across many servings. The final card carries the smell of vinegar soaked deep into the paper through the years. Pickle sandwich. The mother opens the jar of pickles and places several thin slices onto bread spread with whatever fat remains in the kitchen. The crunch of pickled cucumber made the simple sandwich feel more alive inside a diet filled with starch and very few choices. It did not keep a stomach full as long as beans or potatoes, but it made a meal feel less sad. The pantry historian sets those three cards aside and looks at the open box beneath the old yellow light. Peanut butter with pickles. Banana. Pickles alone. Three meals that seem completely unrelated, yet all of them tell the same story. That poor kitchens never cooked according to perfect ideas. They cooked from what remained on the shelf, from the memory carried in the hands, and from the instinct to keep a family moving through one more day. Every region had its own poor man's sandwich. As the next cards are pulled from the box, the story begins to grow beyond the kitchen of one single family. The smell of old paper now mixes with the scent of cornmeal, dried mayonnaise, and the faint sourness of long-pickled food. Some of the cards carry handwriting completely different from the others, as if they came from kitchens separated by hundreds of miles. One card carries the spirit of the South with cast-iron skillets and yellow cornmeal. Another feels like the memory of crowded church gatherings. Another speaks of cuts of meat that modern people often turn away from very quickly. And the deeper the pantry historian flips through the box, the more he resembles someone preserving the kitchen map of working America rather than simply a storyteller speaking about sandwiches. The first card carries dried cornmeal dust along the edge of the paper. Hot water cornbread sandwich. The mother pours hot water into the cornmeal and mixes it with salt until the mixture holds together. She shapes it into a flat cake and places it into a hot cast iron skillet, where the edges darken into deep gold and release a faint crisp sound. Then the cornbread is placed between two slices of white bread with a little lard or molasses if any remains in the house. To people living comfortably, it may sound like far too much starch for one meal. But in many poor southern communities, cornmeal was the thing that carried working people through longer days. It was cheap, familiar, and heavy enough to keep a stomach quiet for a few more hours. Then came the pimento cheese sandwich, a meal carrying the memory of long church tables and crowded gatherings where food had to be stretched thin enough for everyone. The mother grated the little cheese that remained and mixed it with mayonnaise and finely chopped red pimento peppers. The pale orange mixture was spread evenly onto white bread before being cut into small triangles. This meal was not born from abundance. It was born from the skill of turning little into more, so that at one long table everyone could feel they had been invited to eat, just like everybody else. The final cards make many modern people hesitate a little longer. Tongue sandwich, head cheese, souse. The cuts of meat, once considered lowly, appeared constantly inside working-class kitchens and immigrant communities. The mother simmered the meat for hours until it softened, then sliced it thin and placed it between bread with mustard or pickles. During those difficult years, no part of the animal was allowed to disappear too quickly. And what the pantry historian tries to preserve through these cards is not the strangeness of the meals, but the dignity of people who knew how to continue living with the very things others looked down upon. Every poor region carried its own sandwich. The South had cornmeal and cast-iron skillets. Churches had pimento cheese and long tables. Working neighborhoods had cheap cuts of meat cooked slowly with patience. Different ingredients, different smells, different flavors. Yet all of them tell the same old story, that the history of working America was once placed between two slices of bread by hands that knew how to stretch everything one more day. The sandwiches of shame. Not every poor man's sandwich became a warm memory. Some meals once kept countless people from going hungry. Yet years later, when life became more comfortable, people avoided speaking about them the same way they avoided reopening an old door. And sometimes poverty revealed itself most clearly in a very small moment, when a child opened a lunch pail at school, smelled the onion rising into the classroom air, then quietly closed the lid again before anyone else could look over. The pantry historian reads these cards more slowly. They do not carry only the names of meals. They preserve the feeling of years when people had very few choices, when one sandwich could be both lunch and the thing a child most wanted to hide. The first card reads, Onion Sandwich. The mother peels away the dry outer skin and slices the onion into paper-thin rounds. A little salt is sprinkled over the slices to soften the sharpness before they are placed between two slices of bread, spread with whatever grease or mayonnaise remains at the bottom of the jar. She wraps the sandwich carefully in brown paper, as if that alone could hold the onion smell inside a little longer. But onions are difficult to hide. Their smell clings to hands, lunch pails, and even the air of an afternoon classroom. To the mother, this was a meal that was cheap, easy to find, and flavorful enough to keep white bread from tasting too plain. To the child carrying it to school, sometimes it became the thing they feared other people noticing most. Then came liver sandwich and olive loaf sandwich, the cheap lunch meats that filled countless working-class lunch pails during the early 20th century. The mother sliced the meat very thin and laid it slightly unevenly across the bread, so it appeared like more than it truly was. A little mustard or pickle was added if the house still had any left. These meals were practical, full of protein, full of flavor, and cheap enough to buy near the end of the month when money was almost gone. But when life improved, many people began wanting to forget them, because they brought back memories of the cheapest meat counter, the thinnest slices, and the feeling of counting every coin before the store clerk. The final card is softer around the edges because tomato juice had soaked through it many times over the years. Tomato sandwich. One ripe tomato from the backyard garden is sliced thick and placed onto bread with a little salt and pepper. The tomato juice soaks into the bread until it becomes so soft that it must be eaten quickly before falling apart in the hands. This meal carried a different kind of poverty, gentler, brighter, and filled with the smell of summer. It speaks of the small backyard garden, hands still stained with dirt from picking vegetables, and the years when people still understood that tomatoes only tasted right in their proper season. Those sandwiches once helped people survive difficult years, yet the memories attached to them sometimes became too heavy to carry untouched. And perhaps that is the saddest thing about this recipe box, that many meals disappeared not because they were useless, but because they carried too many images of a time when people had struggled very hard to escape, when packaged food made us forget how to stretch things. Convenience did not enter the kitchen like something frightening. It arrived very gently, almost like a form of relief. A can of processed meat is resting neatly on the shelf, a package of lunch meat already sliced into perfect, even pieces. A bottle of sauce with instructions clearly printed on the back label. And after many years of standing before nearly empty kitchen cabinets calculating every portion of food, many mothers felt for the first time that they could breathe a little easier. No more scraping the bottom of the skillet to preserve the flavor of meat. No more wondering how far yesterday's soft potatoes could still be stretched. The kitchen began to move faster, cleaner, quieter. The pantry historian does not tell this part with bitterness. He simply places two worlds beside each other and allows the viewer to feel for themselves what changed over time. The first card rests beside the faded label of an old canned product, canned meat sandwich. People opened the can with a small metal tool and spread the soft meat inside onto bread. Lunch could now be made far more quickly than in kitchens that once had to simmer beans for hours or save every spoonful of gravy from the night before. For families exhausted by work and bills, canned food truly was a tremendous help. But at the same time, the kitchen slowly stopped needing many of its old skills. Hands no longer had to remember how to stretch the leftovers from supper into the next day. Then came the packaged deli sandwich, where slices of lunch meat rested neatly inside clean packaging, each one looking the same. People opened the package, placed a few slices onto bread, then added cheese or sauce. Everything happened very quickly. No need to slice leftover meat from last night's supper. No need to mix cracker crumbs into canned fish to create more portions. No need to stare into a skillet wondering whether the remaining grease could become gravy. Modern life made everything much easier. And because it became easier, many skills that once lived inside working-class kitchens slowly faded into memory. The final card is hardly even a recipe anymore. It feels more like a contrast between two different eras. A modern sandwich with soft bread, neatly layered meat, pre-washed vegetables, and bottled sauce stands beside the memory of poor sandwiches once created from whatever remained in the kitchen. Today, sandwiches may be more beautiful, more complete, and more dependable. But they no longer ask the person making them to look at a soft potato and see lunch, or look at the grease at the bottom of a skillet and see one more meal for the family. What faded away over time was not only the food itself, it was a very quiet kind of wisdom carried by old kitchens, where people learned how to turn very little into enough. And perhaps that is what this recipe box is trying to preserve through every yellowed recipe card, that before everything came pre-packaged and stacked high in supermarkets, there were once hands that knew how to stretch the life of a meal far beyond what it appeared to be. The wish sandwich and the quiet scar of a generation. Some poor sandwiches still carried enough flavor to remain in memory. A thin layer of grease, a little sugar, one sharp slice of onion, the final red streak of ketchup from the bottom of the bottle. But eventually the recipe box leads toward almost empty cards, where hunger is no longer hidden beneath flavor at all. And at the very bottom of the box rests a name that sounds more like a joke than a meal. Wish sandwich. 2 slices of bread pressed together with the wish that there might be something in between them. The pantry historian holds these cards longer than the others. They are so light they almost seem weightless, yet they feel heavier than many meals inside the box. Because this is no longer a story about the clever resourcefulness of poor kitchens, this is the part of memory where almost every choice had already run out. The first card reads, mayonnaise sandwich. The mother uses the tip of a knife to gather the final bit of mayonnaise from the jar and pulls it into the thinnest possible layer across the bread. The spread is so thin that the kitchen light almost shines through it. If butter remains, she spreads only enough to make the surface of the bread barely glisten. Even with so little, she still prepares it carefully, because a sandwich made with care always feels different from 2 slices of bread pushed hurriedly across the table. This meal lives on the fragile line between still having a little and having almost nothing left at all. Then came the plain bread sandwich. 2 slices of bread are placed together in silence. The mother still cuts it in half, still wraps it in paper or cloth as if there were truly filling inside. That is one of the hardest parts of the Great Depression to look at, the way the shape of a meal itself sometimes became a form of comfort. A child carrying that sandwich to school could still feel like they had brought lunch, just like the other children, even though both slices of bread held only space between them. And then the box opens to the final card, Wish Sandwich. Perhaps it was never truly a recipe at all. Perhaps someone simply scribbled the word wish onto the paper and slipped it into the box as a way of laughing softly at hunger. People placed 2 slices of bread together and joked about imagining meat inside, or cheese, or anything else that could make the sandwich feel like a real meal. But anyone who lived through years of scarcity understood that the joke was never entirely a joke. The wish sandwich is no longer simply food. It is the quiet scar of an entire generation that grew up carrying the feeling of constant shortage. The children who once ate it may later have become the adults who scraped plates clean, saved glass jars, folded paper neatly, and stored every leftover piece inside the refrigerator. Not because they were selfish or miserly. Their bodies still remembered the feeling of staring at 2 slices of bread and wishing there might be something more between them today. After that card, the recipe box almost stops looking like a collection of meals. It begins to resemble proof that an entire generation survived poverty through quiet endurance, through small jokes that made hunger feel a little less frightening, and through hands that still tried to preserve the shape of a meal even when there was almost nothing left to place on the table. Before the recipe box is closed again, the recipe box still sits open beneath the yellow light at the end of the day. The curled recipe cards rest quietly across the wooden table, carrying old grease stains, faded coffee marks, and pencil lines softened by many passing years. Sugar sandwich, ketchup, potato, onion, wish. Those tiny names sound almost too simple to become history. Yet throughout the years of the Great Depression, they were once the way many families kept tomorrow still arriving. The 30 sandwiches we have just passed through were never created to impress anyone. They were born from what remained in the kitchen, from a nearly empty jar of mayonnaise, a little gravy left at the bottom of a skillet, the final soft potato in the basket, a small can of fish stretched further with cracker crumbs, the sharp smell of onion rising from a lunch pail, a ripe tomato growing behind the house, and sometimes from the space itself between 2 slices of bread. But inside those kitchens, almost nothing was considered useless if it could still help someone survive one more lunch. The pantry historian places each card back into the box slowly, as if he is putting away one small piece of working America's memory. Some cards resemble recipes. Some look like hurried reminders written before leaving for work. And some contain almost nothing except a single word. Yet every one of them preserves the traces of women who once stood inside cold kitchens near the end of the month, staring at the remaining scraps of food and wondering how to make sure their children still had something to carry with them tomorrow. During those years, sandwiches were not made in abundance. They were created from whatever remained at the very end. A little sugar, 1 slice of pickle, 1 small egg, a thin layer of grease, 1 spoonful of beans left from the night before, and behind all of it were the hands of mothers who understood that sometimes keeping a family alive for one more day was already a very great victory. Many modern people look at these meals and see only scarcity, but sometimes the kitchens with the least understood the value of every slice of bread more clearly than anyone else. They understood how to save the gravy at the bottom of a skillet, how to stretch 1 small can of fish into many meals, how to make even the simplest sandwich feel prepared with care. Those kitchens may have been quiet near the end of the month, cold during winter, and filled with lunches that children once felt ashamed to carry to school. But they continued living, continued feeding people, and continued passing down a very quiet kind of wisdom from one generation to the next. Perhaps your own family once had a sandwich like this. A simple meal your grandmother or mother made without ever looking at a recipe. Perhaps it was a sugar sandwich, a tomato sandwich, a fried egg sandwich, or something else that almost nobody makes anymore. And perhaps somewhere inside your memory there remains the sound of a knife spreading across bread, the smell of a hot cast-iron skillet, or the old jar of grease resting beside the stove. If these old sandwiches remind you of someone who once cooked for you, write their name in the comments. Just one name is enough, because some people are never left behind cookbooks or complete recipes. They left behind only the habit of never wasting food, the hands that knew how to turn very little into enough, and the memory of kitchens that once kept entire families alive with almost nothing at all. The next time you hold a slice of bread in your hand, remember this: there was once a time when that alone could already be an entire meal.